The morning fog rolled in from the Pacific like a shroud, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the California coastline whole. August 16, 1942. 6:03 a.m. Treasure Island Naval Base, San Francisco Bay. The massive shape of Navy blimp L-8 emerged from the mist like a prehistoric beast, its silver skin catching the first pale light of dawn. 157 feet of rubberized fabric and helium, floating silent as death itself. Inside the cramped gondola beneath, Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody adjusted his headset, the leather cold against his skin. Beside him, Ensign Charles Ellis Adams checked the instruments one final time. Fuel full. Helium pressure, optimal. Radio frequency, clear. 2 depth charges secured in the bomb bay, ready to drop on any Japanese submarine foolish enough to surface in American waters. They had done this patrol dozens of times before. Routine submarine reconnaissance. 4 hours out, 4 hours back. Home by lunch. The ground crew released the mooring lines at 6:03 a.m. precisely. L-8 rose into the gray morning, its twin engines humming a low, mechanical prayer. The last anyone saw of Cody and Adams, they were visible through the gondola windows, Cody at the controls, Adams plotting their course on the navigation chart. The blimp turned west, toward the Farallon Islands, toward the open ocean, toward a mystery that would haunt the U.S. Navy for the next 80 years. Because 5 hours later, L-8 would return to land. Its engines would still be running. Its radio would still be operational. Its cargo of depth charges would remain secured and unfired. But Lieutenant Ernest Cody and Ensign Charles Adams would be gone. Vanished. Not a trace of blood, not a sign of struggle, not a single clue to explain how 2 trained naval officers could disappear from a sealed gondola floating 300 feet above the Pacific Ocean. The radio logs would later reveal the last transmission from L-8 came at 7:42 a.m. Cody's voice, calm and professional. Position 4 miles east of Farallons. Investigating oil slick. After that, silence. Not static. Not interference. Just the pure, hollow silence of an open frequency with no one on the other end. The Navy would classify it as unexplained. The press would call it the Ghost Blimp. The families of Cody and Adams would call it an eternity of not knowing. At 8:50 a.m., the freighter George Washington spotted L-8 circling aimlessly 2 miles off the coast. The crew watched through binoculars as the blimp descended to dangerously low altitude, almost kissing the waves, then climbed again in lazy spirals. No response to signal flags. No reaction to the ship's horn. Captain William Morton would later testify. It moved like a ship without a helmsman, just drifting on invisible currents. We could see the gondola clearly. The door was open, swinging on its hinges like a broken jaw. By 10:30 a.m., L-8 had drifted back overland. Residents of Daly City looked up to see the massive airship scraping across the coastal hills, its gondola dragging through the scrub brush like a grotesque metal finger. Margaret Hensley was hanging laundry in her backyard when the shadow fell across her. The engines were still running, she would tell investigators. I could hear them clear as day. But there was something wrong with the sound. Like a heartbeat with no blood behind it. The blimp struck the cliff edge at Olympic Golf Course, bounced once, twice, then settled onto the street like a dying whale. Within minutes, hundreds of onlookers surrounded the deflating corpse of L-8. Teenagers climbed onto the gondola. Souvenir hunters began cutting away pieces of fabric. And still, no sign of Cody or Adams. The first military personnel to arrive found a scene that defied explanation. The gondola door was indeed open, but the safety bar that prevented accidental falls was still in place. Both parachutes remained in their storage positions, properly packed and untouched. The radio microphone hung from its cord, swaying gently, still warm from recent use. On the navigator's table, Adams' pencil lay across the chart, marking a course that would never be completed. His calculation stopped mid-equation, the numbers trailing off into nothing. The engines had run until the fuel was exhausted. The classified codebooks were still locked in their safe. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the small shelf they used as a table, 2 bites missing. Cody's coffee cup, still half full, had spilled across the deck, leaving a brown stain that looked disturbingly like dried blood in the afternoon sun. Lieutenant Commander George Hoyt arrived from Treasure Island within the hour. A 20-year Navy veteran, Hoyt had seen men die in every conceivable way war could devise. But this was different. In combat, he would write in his official report, men leave traces. Blood. Torn clothing. Signs of struggle. Here there was nothing. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. The report, classified for 30 years, would reveal details the public never knew. Both men's personal effects were intact. Wallets with cash. Wedding rings. Cody's lucky silver dollar, a gift from his father, still in his breast pocket. Adam's diary, the morning entry incomplete. August 16th. Weather clear. Visibility good. Feels strange about today's patrol. Can't explain why. We'll write more when we. The Navy launched an investigation that would consume thousands of man-hours and generate over 3,000 pages of testimony, technical analysis, and speculation. Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz himself demanded answers. How do two men vanish from an aircraft in flight? The blimp could not have landed on water. The depth charges were still dry, showing no signs of salt exposure. It could not have descended low enough for the men to jump without leaving the controls. The altitude recorder showed L8 never dropped below 300 feet after leaving the coastline. The autopilot was not engaged. Someone had been flying that blimp until at least 7:42 a.m. After that, the aircraft had drifted on air currents alone, a ghost ship of the sky. The wartime press ran wild with speculation. Japanese submarines had somehow captured them. German spies had infiltrated the base. Secret weapons that vaporized human flesh but left everything else intact. The War Department, desperate to maintain morale, issued statement after statement. Investigation ongoing. No evidence of enemy action. The Navy takes care of its own. But privately, in classified memorandums that wouldn't see light for decades, senior officers admitted complete bafflement. Admiral Harold Stark wrote to President Roosevelt, "We have no explanation that fits the facts. This may be one for the history books to puzzle over." 3 days after the incident, Mary Cody received a telegram. "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your husband, Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody, is missing in action following an aircraft incident over Pacific waters. Search operations continue." She had been married to Ernest for 4 years. They had a 2-year-old son who would never remember his father's face except from photographs. In her diary, discovered after her death in 1987, she wrote, "They tell me he's missing. But missing suggests he might be found. How do you find someone who vanished from the sky?" The technical specifications of the L8 only deepened the mystery. The K-class blimp was one of the most reliable aircraft in the Navy's arsenal. Over 250,000 cubic feet of helium provided lift for a gondola that could carry a crew of 3 plus full combat equipment. Twin Pratt & Whitney R1340 and 2 engines, each producing 425 horsepower, gave it a maximum speed of 80 miles per hour and a range of over 2,000 miles. The gondola itself was essentially a sealed metal box, 20 feet long, 8 feet wide, with reinforced glass windows and a single door that could only be opened from the inside. The door had 3 separate locking mechanisms. All 3 were found in the open position. The morning of August 16th had been chosen specifically for its perfect flying conditions. Weather reports from the Farallon Island station showed calm seas, minimal wind, unlimited visibility. No storms within 500 miles. Water temperature, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. A man in standard Navy gear could survive perhaps 20 minutes in those waters. If both men had somehow fallen into the ocean, the search planes that crisscrossed the area within hours should have found bodies, life jackets, something. They found nothing. Not then. Not ever. Chief Petty Officer Robert Hughes had performed the pre-flight inspection of L8 at 5:30 a.m. In testimony given under oath, he swore the aircraft was in perfect condition. "I checked every rivet, every seam, every instrument. That bird was tight as a drum. Whatever happened up there, it wasn't mechanical failure." Hughes had known Cody personally, had shared drinks with him at the officers' club just 2 nights before. Cody was talking about his son, about teaching him to fish when the war was over. He wasn't suicidal. He wasn't unstable. He was a good officer who loved his job and loved his family. The depth charges L8 carried were each 325 pounds of TNT configured to detonate at preset depths. If dropped accidentally, they would have exploded on impact with the water, visible and audible for miles. No explosions were reported that morning. If the men had encountered an enemy submarine and attempted to attack, the charges would have been dropped. They remained in their racks. The release mechanism had not been touched. Whatever Cody had seen in that oil slick at 7:42 a.m., he had not deemed it worthy of attacking. Squadron records showed that Cody and Adams had flown together 14 times previously. They were considered an excellent team. Cody, at 35, was one of the older pilots in the squadron, methodical and careful. Adams, 27, was known for his precision navigation and had never been off course by more than a mile in over 300 hours of flight time. Both men had been trained in emergency procedures. Both knew how to use parachutes. Both were strong swimmers. The Navy's psychological profiles, conducted on all airship crews, showed no signs of mental instability, no unusual stress beyond the normal pressures of wartime service. The oil slick Cody reported investigating was never found. Ships crossing the area that morning reported no oil, no debris, no signs of any maritime incident. The Japanese Navy's own records, captured after the war, showed no submarines operating within 300 miles of San Francisco on August 16, 1942. The German Kriegsmarine had no vessels in the Pacific at that time. If there had been an enemy contact, it left no trace in any naval archive on either side of the conflict. On August 18, 2 days after the disappearance, a fisherman named Joseph Tazzini reported finding a life jacket washed up on the beach near Pescadero, 30 miles south of San Francisco. The jacket bore the stenciled number that matched L8's equipment manifest. It showed no signs of use. The straps were still tied in the storage position. The whistle was still wrapped in its protective plastic. If either Cody or Adams had worn it, they had somehow removed it while keeping all the fastenings intact. The Navy tested the jacket for blood, for hair, for any biological trace. They found nothing. It was as if it had simply fallen from the gondola into the sea. The investigation expanded. The FBI was brought in to check for sabotage. Naval Intelligence investigated possible espionage. The Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, examined the possibility of new enemy weapons. Each avenue led nowhere. The physical evidence was maddeningly consistent. 2 men had been in that gondola at 7:42 a.m., and sometime before 10:30 a.m., they were not. No bodies. No blood. No signs of violence. No explanation that fit within the laws of physics or the procedures of war. Commander Franklin Shaw, head of the Navy's West Coast Anti-Submarine Warfare Unit, wrote in a classified assessment, "We must consider the possibility that Cody and Adams encountered something beyond our current understanding. This is not a conclusion I reach lightly. But when all possible explanations have been eliminated, we must entertain the impossible." Shaw's superiors ordered this passage removed from all official reports. The Navy could not afford to admit ignorance, not in the middle of a war where confidence was as crucial as ammunition. In the weeks following the incident, 3 more blimps from the same squadron reported unusual experiences over the same patrol area. Strange lights beneath the water. Radio interference that seemed to form patterns, almost like communication. One pilot, Lieutenant James Morrison, claimed his compass spun wildly for 30 seconds while flying over the exact coordinates where L8 had sent its last transmission. The Navy immediately transferred Morrison to a desk job and classified his report. The patrol route was quietly changed. No official explanation was given. The human cost of the mystery extended far beyond the 2 missing men. Helen Adams, Charles's wife, was 7 months pregnant when he disappeared. She gave birth to a daughter who would grow up asking why other children had fathers and she did not. In letters to the Navy Department, Helen pleaded for answers. "Tell me he's dead. Tell me he was captured. Tell me anything but that you don't know. How do I explain to his child that her father simply vanished? The Navy's responses were form letters, bureaucratic expressions of regret that answered nothing. Ernest Cody's mother, Sarah, aged 10 years in the 10 weeks following the disappearance. Neighbors reported seeing her standing in her yard at dawn, looking up at the sky, as if waiting for her son to return the same way he had left. She died in 1944, never knowing what became of her boy. Her last words, according to her nurse, were, "Ernest is calling me. He says he's been trying to come home." The official investigation concluded on November 2, 1942. The final report, signed by Admiral Nimitz himself, stated, "After exhaustive investigation, no definitive cause can be determined for the disappearance of Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams. It is the finding of this board that they be listed as missing in action, presumed dead." But in the margins of his personal copy, discovered in his papers after his death, Nimitz had written one word: impossible. The war moved on. Guadalcanal. Midway. D-Day. The atomic bomb. The mystery of L8 was buried beneath an avalanche of history. But for those who knew, who had been there, who had seen the empty gondola and the swaying microphone, the question remained. Where did they go? How did they go? Why did they go? In 1946, a former Japanese naval officer named Yamamoto Tetsuo claimed under interrogation that Japanese forces had been experimenting with a weapon that could affect human consciousness, causing men to leap from aircraft believing they could fly. The Americans dismissed this as fantasy. But Yamamoto insisted he had seen test results, had watched films of Chinese prisoners walking off cliffs with smiles on their faces. The technology, he claimed, had been deployed only once operationally, against an American aircraft off California in August 1942. When pressed for details, Yamamoto suffered what appeared to be a stroke and never spoke coherently again. The families tried to move on. Mary Cody remarried in 1945 to a schoolteacher who adopted Ernest Jr. and gave him a normal life. But she kept Ernest's photograph on her dresser until the day she died. Helen Adams never remarried. She became a teacher, raised her daughter alone, and every August 16th, she would drive to the coast and stand on the cliffs, looking out at the Pacific, waiting for answers that never came. In 1962, 20 years after the disappearance, a construction crew building a new housing development in the hills above Daly City discovered human remains buried in a shallow grave. The skeleton was missing its skull and hands, making identification impossible. The Navy was called. Tests were inconclusive. The remains could have been Cody or Adams. They could have been anyone. The bones were interred in a military cemetery under a marker reading, "Unknown Sailor, Pacific Theater, 1942. Mary Cody requested to see the remains. Her request was denied. The blimp itself, L8, was repaired and returned to service. It flew anti-submarine patrols for the remainder of the war without incident. Pilots reported no unusual sensations, no mechanical problems. But ground crews whispered that on foggy mornings, you could sometimes hear voices in the gondola, muffled conversations that stopped the moment you opened the door. After the war, L8 was retired to Goodyear's airship operations, where it flew as a commercial blimp over sporting events and state fairs. The gondola where Cody and Adams vanished carried advertisements for tires and televisions, the mystery of its past forgotten by all but a few. Lieutenant Commander Hoyt, who had led the initial investigation, spent his retirement researching the case. His personal files, donated to the Naval Historical Center after his death in 1978, contained over 500 pages of notes, theories, and correspondence with physicists, psychologists, and even parapsychologists. His final theory, never officially proposed, was that Cody and Adams had encountered what he called a temporal anomaly, a rift in space-time that had transported them elsewhere. The evidence, he wrote, suggests not that they died, but that they went somewhere we cannot follow. In 1975, a retired fisherman named Carlos Mendoza came forward with a story he had been afraid to tell for 33 years. On the morning of August 16, 1942, He had been fishing off the Farallon Islands when he saw L8 descend almost to the water's surface. Through his binoculars, he watched two figures in naval uniforms climb out of the gondola and stand on its exterior, looking down at something in the water. They appeared to be having an animated conversation, pointing and gesturing. Then, Mendoza claimed, both men simply stepped off the gondola and fell toward the water. But they never hit it. They disappeared, he said, like they fell through a door in the air. 1 second they were there, the next they were not. No splash. No nothing. Just gone. Mendoza had told no one at the time, fearing he would be thought insane or, worse, suspected of involvement in their disappearance. The Navy reopened the case briefly in 1975 based on Mendoza's testimony. Divers searched the seafloor beneath the coordinates he provided. They found nothing. No bodies. No equipment. No evidence that anyone had ever been there. The case was closed again, this time permanently. The official stance remained unchanged: missing in action, presumed dead, cause unknown. In 1982, the Freedom of Information Act released thousands of pages of classified World War II documents. Among them, researchers found a curious report from the Office of Naval Intelligence dated August 20, 1942. It described intercepted German radio transmissions that mentioned the American airship incident, and expressed confusion about conflicting reports of the crew's status. One transmission, only partially decoded, seemed to ask, "How can they be both dead and alive?" The context for these messages was never explained. Germany had no known intelligence assets in position to observe the L8 incident. Yet they knew about it within days and were asking questions that suggested they knew more than they should have. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a quantum physicist at MIT, published a paper in 1988 proposing that L8 had flown through a localized manifestation of what she called quantum superposition at the macro level. In layman's terms, a spot where the normal rules of reality temporarily broke down. Under specific atmospheric conditions, she wrote, it's theoretically possible for matter to exist in multiple states simultaneously. The crew of L8 might have experienced a moment where they were both in the gondola and not in the gondola, both alive and dead, both present and absent. When the superposition collapsed, they remained in whichever state they had been observing at that crucial moment. The scientific community largely dismissed her theory as speculation. But the Navy quietly consulted with her for 3 years, though the nature of their discussions remained classified. The last surviving witness to the L8 incident was Margaret Hensley, the woman who had seen the blimp dragging across her neighborhood. In 2001, at the age of 93, she gave a final interview to a documentary crew. People ask me what I think happened, she said, her voice still clear despite her age. I'll tell you what I've never told anyone. When that gondola passed over my yard, close enough I could have hit it with a rock, I looked inside through the open door. And for just a second, just a heartbeat, I saw them. 2 men in Navy uniforms, standing at the controls, looking straight ahead like they were still flying. But they were transparent, like looking through water. Then I blinked and they were gone. I've carried that image for 60 years. They're still up there somewhere, trying to complete their mission, trying to come home. In 2005, the U.S. Navy's Naval Heritage and History Command conducted a final review of the L8 case using modern forensic techniques and computer modeling. They reconstructed the flight path, analyzed weather patterns, simulated every possible scenario. Their conclusion, buried in Appendix J of a 300-page report that few would ever read, was remarkable for its honesty. Despite technological advances and extensive analysis, the disappearance of Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams remains unexplained. The physical evidence is internally consistent but collectively impossible. No theory adequately accounts for all observed facts. The families eventually found their own peace. Ernest Cody Jr. became a commercial airline pilot, spending his life in the sky where his father had vanished. He flew the San Francisco to Hawaii route for 30 years, and on every flight, when he passed over the coordinates where L8 had sent its last transmission, he would whisper, "Hi, Dad." Charles Adams's daughter became a naval officer herself, rising to the rank of commander. She kept her father's photograph in her cabin on every ship she served aboard. Neither sought answers anymore. The mystery had become part of their identity, a defining absence that shaped who they became. In 2012, 70 years after the incident, the Navy held a memorial service for Cody and Adams at the site where L8 had crashed in Daly City. A small plaque was installed on a stone overlooking the ocean. It reads, "In memory of Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Ellis Adams, United States Navy. Lost August 16, 1942. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old." Veterans, families, and history enthusiasts gathered to remember two men who had become famous not for how they died, but for how they disappeared. During the ceremony, as the Navy chaplain read the benediction, witnesses reported seeing a strange shadow pass over the gathering. Looking up, they saw nothing but clear sky. The shadow moved against the wind, maintaining the distinctive elongated shape of an airship. It passed over the memorial once, twice, then drifted out to sea and vanished. The incident was caught on multiple cell phone cameras. Analysis of the footage showed an atmospheric anomaly consistent with heat distortion, though the temperature that day was a cool 62 degrees. The Navy declined to comment. In 2018, a tech billionaire funded a deep-sea exploration of the area where L8 had reported the oil slick. Using advanced sonar and remotely operated vehicles, the team mapped every inch of seafloor in a 10-square-mile grid. At a depth of 400 feet, they discovered an anomaly, a perfectly circular depression in the seabed, 30 feet in diameter, where no marine life grew. The rock at the center showed signs of exposure to extreme heat, though no volcanic activity had ever been recorded in the area. Water samples from directly above the circle showed trace amounts of chemicals that didn't match any known compound. The expedition's lead scientist, Dr. James Chen, noted in his report, "It's as if something happened here that scorched the very ocean floor. But what could do that in 1942? What can do that now?" The Navy's current position on the L8 incident remains unchanged from 1942, missing in action, presumed dead. But in the Pentagon's basement, in a locked filing cabinet in a locked room that requires top-secret clearance to enter, there exists a file labeled L8 Unresolved. Inside are photographs never released to the public, testimonies never included in official reports, and a single page, author unknown, that contains just one paragraph. "They are still out there. We have detected their radio transmissions on frequencies that shouldn't exist, heard their voices calling for landing instructions at bases that were decommissioned decades ago. Cody and Adams are trying to come home. They have been trying to come home for 80 years. We don't know how to help them. We don't know how to stop them. We can only listen to their ghost signals and wonder, what happened in those 5 hours? What did they find? What found them?" The Ghost Blimp Incident remains the Navy's most puzzling aviation mystery. Unlike other disappearances, which at least offer the cold comfort of probable death, L8 offers nothing but questions. The blimp returned. The men did not. Everything was normal. Nothing was normal. They were there until they weren't. They left no trail to follow, no mystery to solve, just an empty gondola and the endless sky. On quiet nights at naval air stations along the Pacific coast, radar operators sometimes report brief contacts that match the signature of a K-class blimp. The contacts appear for seconds, moving at impossible speeds, then vanish. These incidents are logged but not investigated. Old-timers know what they are. "It's Cody and Adams," they say. "Still on patrol, still searching for submarines, still trying to complete a mission that ended 80 years ago." The last official document in the Navy's L8 file is a memorandum dated January 1, 2000, from the Chief of Naval Operations. It states, "The investigation into the disappearance of Lieutenant E.D. Cody and Ensign C. Adams is hereby permanently suspended. No further resources will be allocated to this matter. The case will remain classified as unresolved in perpetuity." But handwritten at the bottom, in pencil, someone has added, "They're still out there." Today, if you stand on the cliffs above Daly City on a foggy morning, when the mist rolls in from the Pacific just as it did on August 16, 1942, locals say you can sometimes hear them. The drone of twin Pratt and Whitney engines. The crackle of radio static. And if you listen very carefully, a voice, calm and professional, eternally transmitting. L8 to base. Position 4 miles east of Farallones. Investigating oil slick. Then silence. The same silence that has echoed for 8 decades. The silence of men who stepped out of our world and into mystery, leaving behind only questions that have no answers, a ghost story that happens to be true, and a blimp that came home without its crew. In the end, perhaps that's all we can know. That on a clear morning in 1942, 2 men flew into the sky and found something that unmade them, something that removed them from our reality, as cleanly as an eraser removes pencil from paper. They left no farewell, no explanation, no evidence of their fate. They simply ceased to be where they should have been and perhaps began to be somewhere else, someone else, somehow else. The Navy lists them as dead. Their families mourned them as dead. History records them as dead. But somewhere, in some fold of space and time that we cannot perceive, Ernest Cody and Charles Adams may still be flying, still searching, still trying to understand what happened to them in those lost hours between the last transmission and the empty gondola. The ghost blimp of World War II remains our most perfect mystery, a locked room puzzle where the room was flying 300 feet above the ocean, where the door was found open but the men couldn't have jumped, where everything was normal except for the absolute impossibility of what occurred. It is a reminder that even in our mapped and measured world, even in the rigid structure of military protocol, even in the clear light of a California morning, the impossible sometimes happens. Men vanish. Blimps return empty. And we are left with nothing but questions that echo through history like radio calls that no one will ever answer. Static. Silence. The engines drone on. Somewhere they are still flying.